That was Tony Paterson on AM Agenda. Joining me live now on the program is Liberal Senator James Paterson for his thoughts. Senator, thanks for your time.
Good morning, Tom.
Where do you sit on this? Does it need to get through party room?
Well, Tom, I'm really loath to become a commentator on the internal Liberal and National Party policy processes, but I guess the cat is really out of the bag on this one, and it's been well canvassed in the media for several months now. So, look, there's not really that much of a gap between what Tony Paterson said this morning and what the Prime Minister and Josh Frydenberg have said. What happened here, Tom, is that a few months ago, Josh Frydenberg gave a presentation to the Coalition Party Room on energy policy and on the NEG. And what he got from the party room was, in principle, support for the NEG, and as Tony said this morning, authorisation to go and develop the final details of the package. Now, like any policy of the federal government, it ultimately does have to come back to the party room because it has to come back in the form of legislation, which we have not seen yet, and the party room has to give approval to every piece of legislation that's introduced to the parliament. So that is the final stage, and that has not yet happened.
Right, so from the point of view of the Premiers saying, hey, we won't agree to this until we see the final details, do you understand their position as well?
Well, Tom, if you were drawing up a list of people to consult on energy policy, Daniel Andrews would literally be the last person in Australia you would go and speak to about energy policy. This is a Premier who presided over the premature early closure of the Hazelwood Power Station in Victoria, shutting off 25% of Victoria's electricity supply, which has resulted in a doubling of wholesale electricity prices. So frankly, we have to consult Daniel Andrews because that's the process of COAG, but really his opinion is not worth the paper it's written on.
Where do you sit on this? At this stage, we've got quite a bit of information already on the table. Are you supportive of the policy, what we know about it?
Well, like all my colleagues, I've agreed in principle to the NEG, and like all my colleagues, I'm looking forward to seeing that final detail in terms of the legislation, because in this policy area, as fiendishly complex as it is, the devil is in the detail, and it's very important and very appropriate that we give it that scrutiny that it needs. Frankly, I think in this policy area more than any other, over the last decade, most of the policies that have been introduced have not received the kind of rigour and scrutiny that they deserve, have not received the kind of input that it should have from the full spectrum of a government's party room. So this one really needs to do that. I mean, I'm thinking back to, for example, Tom, to the introduction of the renewable energy target in the final days of the Howard government. If anyone in that party room had known the full implications of what would happen with a renewable energy target, there is no way on this earth they would have agreed to it, and yet they did. And so I think that just highlights how careful we need to be in this place.
Right, but what we've known since, what we've found out since you gave as one of the party room members in principle agreement, you haven't seen anything that would be a deal breaker since then in terms of details about the NEG, the modelling, what the ACCC's done, what AEMO's done?
It's very easy, Tom, to envisage a good NEG, a well-designed NEG that I and my colleagues would be really happy to support, and it's also easy to envisage a bad NEG that we would not support. And so we have to see the final detail before we give our final support. But I have to say, Josh Frydenberg is a colleague I have a lot of confidence in. I don't envy his task having to shepherd this through COAG, and I certainly don't want to see a bad deal come out of COAG. I mean, my view is no deal out of COAG would be better than a bad deal out of COAG, but I'm sure that Josh Frydenberg won't be agreeing to a bad deal out of COAG.
What's a bad NEG, though, then, in your opinion?
Well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, Tom. It will put your listeners to sleep even early this time in the morning. But this is not so much weeds. I
mean, do you have a key principle about that? You've already formed a view, as you said, on what could be a bad NEG or a good NEG. Can you give any example on what a bad NEG would contain?
I'll just say in general terms, Tom, that the kind of NEG that I imagine that Daniel Andrews would like to implement is not one that me and my colleagues would like to implement. He's already said that he wants to be able to very quickly and very easily scale up the emissions reduction target. I don't want to make it easy for him or his friends in any future possible Labor government to do that. I don't want, for example, the Victorian State Government to be able to double or triple their emissions reduction target and for an increased burden to fall on other states as part of that. We don't want states holding the rest of the country to ransom. If Victoria is crazy enough to elect a government that wants to have extra emissions reduction targets, well, that's a matter for them, but that should take away from the task of other state governments, not add to it.
All right, there's some markers put down. When you say easily scale up emissions reductions targets, if it stays obviously as it is now within the federal parliament, that would be the marker for you, that it has to be an act of federal parliament to change the emissions target?
Well, it would just seem logical, Tom. We have agreed to Paris emissions reduction targets of 26 to 28%. That is the Australian government position. That is the position of the Parliament. I don't see why it should be any greater than that. And if any future government wants to change that, well, then they should have to earn a mandate from the people in order to do that. And they should have to demonstrate they have that mandate by getting it through the Parliament.
So I guess they're two different things, though, aren't they? Does Labor earn the mandate if they go to this election saying we want 45% and they win the election?
Well, we can only judge them by the standard that they've set as an opposition in this Parliament and the previous one, and the way in which they've respected the mandate that this government has clearly earned for many signature policies, company tax cuts being probably the most prominent of that. We can't force them to vote for our policies in the Senate as much as they like to, and they certainly won't be able to force a possible future Liberal and National opposition to vote for their policies, so they have to earn enough support in the community to be able to get it through both houses of Parliament. That's the way our system works.
All right, that's an interesting bar, I suppose, to set for the future for both major parties, but it might have been set anyway in the past few years, James Paterson. Just on immigration and the debate playing out today, Alan Tudge is resisting calls for any sort of inquiry. Where do you sit on the numbers, the impact on society at the moment?
Well, Tom, we have Senate and parliamentary inquiries into much less substantial things than our population or our immigration. There are dozens of Senate inquiries going on at any one time, all of them worthy in their own way, but probably some of which attract less attention and interest from the Australian people than this would. I don't have any in principle opposition to another inquiry that looks at these issues, but I have to say I've got confidence in ministers like Peter Dutton and Alan Tudge and Angus Taylor in this portfolio and the way that they've managed this issue. And I'm particularly excited by the announcement that Alan Tudge has made that the government is looking at instituting a proper values test for future migrants to Australia, because I think more important than anything, and particularly even more important than the numbers, is ensuring that the migrants that do come to Australia have been carefully selected on the basis that they share and want to uphold Australian values, not that they are hostile to them.
Just finally on that and some of the talk about immigration and different communities in Australia, do you think there's any different about the recent waves to Australia? It seems to me forever in Australia we've had people come here, they take a little bit of time to get used to the country and I suppose assimilate, spread out into the community.
Well, Tom, there's actually some really positive stories on recent waves of immigration that you don't hear a lot about. So the extra special intake of Syrian refugees that we took in the wave of the Syrian crisis a couple of years ago, on the early evidence shows really positive results, very high rates of integration, very high rates of engagement in education and the workplace, very high rates of take-up of English language classes and learning. And many of them have moved to regional areas. Some of them have been sponsored by local churches and are very connected in their communities. So there are some really positive stories from recent migrant intakes, as well as, obviously, some negative ones that we've been reading about as well.
There have been a few stories on the positive ones as well and really boosting community towns. So, yeah, good to talk about. James Paterson, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.